Hey everyone, welcome back. Welcome to my TFD talk. Hopefully after this video today, you'll have a clear understanding on how skill damage scales and be able to figure out why build makers use certain stat mods over others. Perhaps this will let you figure out and optimize your own builds too. Today we're going to break down the nitty-gritty on exactly how skill damage is calculated and how each stat interacts. Early note, I'll be referring to skill power modifier stat lines as motion value later in the video. You'll see why later. If you skip this, don't worry, I'll mention it again there. At the end of each chapter, I will also give a TLDR of what the findings mean and how it impacts your mod selection decision. Examples will also be given, where appropriate, to exceptions of the rule. Ready to get started? Let's hop right in. For skill damage, the equation can be simplified into this. Now, if you're wondering why so many brackets, it's to determine the order of operations because each of these terms can be further broken down. For simplicity's sake, we'll ignore crits for today's calcs because it's rather obvious whether or not it's worth modding crit onto a Descendant skill DPS. Enemy modifiers depend on classification like elites, bosses, etc. and also levels, so I will ignore that since you cannot control these values. That means we cut the equation that matters for Descendant modding down to just this. Let's get into the sections for each of these terms. Flat skill power currently comes from only one source in the game, your reactor. It's the big stat at the top left. Maybe sometime in the future we'll have more ways to get this, like substats on some gear, etc. But for now it's just your reactor. Everything scales off of this. So the optimization condition is a separate multiplier than everything else that does not interact with any mods or stats or buffs, so you should always aim to activate it for ability DPS builds. It's literally a 60% total damage buff. For weapon platforms, it is less important, depending on how much damage on your DPS profile comes from abilities versus weapons. Now, for the next part, this is where the weird stuff begins, and the reason why I had the brackets ordered the way you see in the equation. First of all, power boost ratio. The terms skill power percent and skill power boost ratio percent are actually the exact same thing. Now, I don't know why they chose to give two separate terms like this, but just know that all versions of skill power and equivalent mods are actually skill power boost ratio percent and is listed on this screen as such. So my reactors plus 0.2 times electric ratio and plus 0.082 times electric ratio substat and my plus 46.9% electric power skill percent mod all add together into this plus 0.751 times electric boost ratio stat on the info screen. As the equation states, base skill power percentage is multiplicative to other stats here. But we also know each of the terms in this equation can have prefixes, like electric skill power percent, chill skill power percent, or even just ordinary skill power percent. Does this really matter beyond just whether it applies or not to the matching skill? Actually, it does. Assuming they actually apply to the ability, different prefixes of skill power percent are multiplicative to each other as well, whereas same prefixes are additive. This means that, all other things equal, a build with 50% skill power mod and a 50% electric skill power mod on an electric DPS skill will deal more damage than a build with two 50% skill power mods, or two 50% electric skill power mods. This is also the reason why power increase, the non-prefix skill power percent mod, has lower scaling values than elemental skill power percent. This is because power increases skill power percent is multiplicative to the elemental or subtype variants, whereas elemental and subtype skill power percent is also multiplicative to other prefixes, but diluted and additive to your reactors, matching skill power boost ratio plus 0.2x stats. In endgame, most of the time, power increase is just as strong as an elemental skill power percent mod, within 1% total damage, but can be used for any element build so that you don't have to worry about element specific skill power percent. Before endgame, the elemental skill power percent mods are up to roughly 5% total damage higher than power increase at identical mod ranks. The TLDR is that you will want to use as many different kind of skill power percent prefixes as possible that apply to the DPS skills used. A lot of the time, the game will not allow you to do more of this because of mods remaining available, but hopefully this helps you decide on skill power percent mods. Alright, on to the next term, skill power modifier percent. This one is both simple, but also more complicated. Now, you don't have to worry about additive or multiplicative within this category itself of prefixes for skill power modifier percent. All sources of skill power modifier percent variants are additive to each other every time. Also, this is where I say to just read skill power modifier percent as motion value. Motion value is a term used in many games which defines the adjusted multiplier a move has. This also makes it have a completely different label than skill power percent or boost ratio percent, making it easier to remember what it does and that it is a different stat. For example, spears in games are usually faster weapons compared to other melee, and thus a fast thrust can either hit multiple times or quicker than normal, and usually carry lower motion values to balance out the faster and more frequent hits. Whereas something like a club stick typically swings very slowly, but deals a ton of damage per swing. As a result, club sticks in games will usually have higher motion value multipliers to account for the weapon being slow. Now, that concept of motion values also exists in the first Descendant as well. You see the third skill on Bunny, Lightning Emission, how it says skill power times XYZ number percent value. The skill power term is after everything else in this part of the equation applies. But the XYZ percent number value, that is the default motion value of this skill. This is extremely important because skill power modifier percent mods are additive to the default motion values of any skill, and never, ever multiplicative. Therefore, the lower the default motion value of a skill, the bigger difference a skill power modifier percent mod will make. Say the skill has a 1% motion value. Equipping a mod that gives 10% modifier makes the move now have 11% motion value, multiplying the skill's overall motion value by 11 times, since you went from 1 to 11 or hitting 11 times harder. But the bigger the skill's default motion value, the less a difference a skill power modifier percent mod will make. Say the skill has a 1000% motion value, like VS Assault, which is actually like 1400. Adding 10% makes the move now have 1010% motion value, which multiplies the skill's motion value by 1.01 times. A total 1% total damage increase. To make things slightly more complicated, most mods are identical for elemental versions, like electric skill power, but the skill power modifier percent mods only exist for subtypes, which are dimensional, singular, fusion, and tech. There are dual stat versions that include elements, but only subtypes can get power modifier percent. This matters when you want to focus on two different subtype skills. For example, if you want an all-rounder bunny that can use both her third AoE lightning emission, but also her fourth beam DPS skill on the same build, you need both fusion and singular bonuses. A level 40 bunny has a default motion value on her ult of 502.9% and a default motion value on lightning emission, her third ability, of only 148.7%. As a result, you will get more damage overall of her entire kit by using a power modifier percent mod for her 3 instead of her 4, assuming you want to use both abilities because her 4's motion value is already so high. This means you would use power increase for non-prefix skill power percent, or electric specialist for electric skill power percent. It really doesn't matter which one of those two. But then singular specialist, because it adds 81.2% motion value to your third skill only, which has a default motion value of only 148.7 instead of your alt, which is fusion, but has a default motion value of 502.9. You would also use a reactor with electric skill ratio, obviously, but fusion skill ratio instead for your 4, since fusion skill ratio is multiplicative to your alt, whereas your third skill is already supercharged by the singular specialist mod. The TLDR is that you will want to use skill power modifier % mods on skills with very low default motion values, or in the case of two DPS skills with different subtypes, the one with lower default motion values. On the other hand, skill power modifier % mods make little difference on skills with very high default motion values, like VS's ult, which is well over 1000%. It will still be a damage increase, but it's a small one, very small, so that might be better spent on quality of life, survivability, energy economy, range, literally any other stat. You gotta decide what you want. Again, the total damage before enemy defense or defense tread can be calculated from what I've discussed earlier per this equation, which includes reactor skill power, your optimization condition %, your actual equipped skill power %, which is the same as boost ratio, and any motion value bonuses, which is skill power modifier %. Generally, this should be rather simple to solve for optimal modding, but this is also where I will introduce my super duper simple spreadsheet calculator to check your total damage in advance. You basically put in your reactor skill power and whether or not you meet the optimization mounting condition for plus 60%. If you meet it, you put a 0.6 here. If you don't, you put a 0. These are a one and done deal. Next are the power skill boost ratio values and bonus substats from your reactors. Now you don't need to calculate these because it is collapsed into your info stats screen here automatically. Now there are 3 skill power % boxes below this. Let's assume I'm testing Bunny calcs for her third skill, lightning emission. The first represents non-prefixed skill power %, aka base skill power ratio, which can come from mods like power increase or the master mods from the battle category. The second box represents whatever element skill power % you want to use, which in this case is electric skill power %. The third box represents whatever subtype skill power % you want to use, like singular skill power %. To fill these boxes in, you will go to your inventory screen after you make your build and press W to go into the info dropdown. If you see the term base skill power boost ratio, you will put that value into this first box. If not, you just set it to 0. The elemental power boost ratio, in this case electric power boost ratio, shows next. Copy that value into the second box. Then we have subtype power boost ratio. In this case, singular power boost ratio. You copy that value into the third box. Finally, the motion value boxes. The first box, you put in the motion value of the skill itself. For example, is 148.7 for lightning emission. I know this ability also has an electrocution dot, and if you want a damage for that, just duplicate the sheet and change the motion value to 53.1. Anyways, we're only looking at the direct hit of her skill. The second box below it is for the subtype modifier % mods. To get that value, go back to your info tab after you made the build and look below all of the power boost ratio stats. This is where all skill modifier % values are found. Put the matching motion value bonus that applies to this skill in this box. For example, for lightning emission, I would only be looking for singular power modifier %, which on this build is 44.1. If you don't have the stat, you can set it to 0. And that's it. Ignoring crits, whatever shows up in this box down here is the total damage of your ability. So now what you will want to do is use the knowledge I taught you about skill power % and skill power modifier % to mod the elemental and subtype options in a way that makes this total damage box as big as possible. Or if adding a new mod barely makes a difference, maybe you'll look for quality of life instead. Feel free to copy the sheet from description or pinned and use it yourself. Thank you once again for checking out my skill power mechanics guide. Hopefully this video has helped you understand how to build for skill damage on Descendants. Of course, there are some exceptions. For example, Jaber having a little bit of wonky math, which I might get to in the future. If you have any questions, do feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll be actively streaming this game almost every day, so you might be able to get your question answered sooner if you ask me while I'm live. Cheers! If this is your first time watching, feel free to leave a like or better yet subscribe. Stick around if you want to see interesting videos on a nearly daily basis. You don't want to miss out on any of that, do you? That'll be it for this video. Thank you all for watching and see you all next time.